So about 2 to 3 years ago, there was this massive wave of workflow automation tools. You had generic ones like Zapier, Make.com, N8N, tools that let anyone build workflows without writing a single line of code. And then riding on top of that wave, new tools started showing up which were more specialized. Tools built specifically for SEO and content marketing, and AirOps was one of the big ones. And they were quite good. To be honest, they still are. You could drag and drop, connect nodes, build content pipelines. For a moment, it felt like everyone is using one of these tools. Every SEO team, every content team was building workflows, automating pipeline. It was the thing. And AirOps went a step further. They built Copilot within their product, so you could describe what you wanted, and the Copilot AI assistant will build the workflow for you. So AirOps was one of the first tools in the space giving a prompt-driven experience of building workflows inside their product. A bit smart move. So on one hand, we had all of these workflow automation tools in the trend, and at the same time, LLMs kept getting better. Claude kept getting better. And by the time when Claude Code came out last year, that's when it started feeling a little pointless. Because why would you use your brain power to build workflows manually, trying to figure out how to connect this node to that node in a drag and drop setting, wiring up a workflow manually, when you could just give Claude a prompt, hand it a couple of APIs, and have the entire thing built for you in a couple of minutes. That's where, in my opinion, these tools started taking somewhat of a hit. As in, if one can just use Claude directly, why would they use even Copilot within a product like AirOps to build their workflow? But out of this entire workflow automation ecosystem, there's one company that has made a very smart move, which is Slate, a workflow tool built specifically for SEO and content. They looked at this problem of their users using more and more of Claude itself, and of course Claude also giving them more and more reasons to feel threatened on a daily basis, and they did something that none other tools have done just yet. They built a Claude MCP, which means you can stay inside Claude, prompt it to build a workflow, and it will construct the entire thing for you within Slate. So no manual nodes configuration, you just describe what you want to Claude and the thing appears in Slate. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how that works, but we're going to start with what MCPs really are, a very high level overview, how SEO and content automation has evolved in the last few years in multiple phases, and then I'm going to show you live how to build an SEO workflow inside Slate using nothing but just a prompt given to Claude. So let's get into it. So let's start with what an MCP really is. It's not going to be very technical, and it's very easy to understand if we just keep the language simple. An MCP stands for Model Context Protocol, which in simple words just means that it's a technology that LLMs can use to communicate and control various tools that could be external. So here in this case, we're looking at Claude as an AI, as an LLM, and if it has an MCP of different products like Google Drive, Slack, HubSpot, or even some app of your own, any kind of external tool or service, it can communicate and use them directly without having to use external, custom code built for each of these tools. The best way to contextualize this is to understand an MCP as a universal plug standard. Right? So for example, back in the days, we had various devices having their own connectors, their own cables and all of that stuff. And then USB-C came out and it became this one single protocol for every single device, right? An MCP for an LLM is pretty much the same thing. If you have an MCP for any app, any software, any API, whatever, right? And you give it to Claude, Claude can then read, write, or act across that tool without using custom code per tool, which means if you didn't have MCPs and you still wanted to use, let's say, Google Drive or whatever, using Claude, you would need custom built, coded integration for each of those tools. But an MCP bridges that gap and makes that connection really, really seamless. So let's look at an example. So if we had an MCP in the real world with an SEO example, right? We're, let's say, working on some sort of a task and we have a couple of different tools that we need to communicate with, and we decided that we're going to use Claude as our primary LLM. So this is what an LLM can do if they have MCPs of different products. Imagine we're using SEMrush, right? So we pull keyword rankings and competitor gap analysis live, and we don't actually go into SEMrush, we just ask Claude to do it. Then we have Notion, which will write briefs directly to your content wikis, right? Again, you can assign this to Notion using Claude because you have the MCP. Then a Slack alert can be set to inform teams when a page drops in rankings. Again, you can just do it through Claude. And then let's say Linear, which is a project management software. If you're using that, you can also auto-create tickets for SEO content teams based on all of those insights that you've collected from other tools. So imagine if you have MCPs of all of these different products, you actually don't have to visit any of them as long as you use an LLM and you're really good at it. So you can construct a workflow that goes something like this. So Claude pulls keyword data from SEMrush, writes a brief inside Notion, and then pings Slack for different channels, different teams, and all of it happens maybe in a single prompt. What this saves you with is, of course, not having to hop into different tabs, not having to do a lot of, granular groundwork for each of these software products. You can just use Claude as the main connector of all of these different software solutions and have it control all of your tools in a single tab, in a single chat interface. It's like you have an assistant in your team who will do everything that you say, and all you have to do is write them a message, right? As long as you have this MCPs for each of those software solutions. Now, I want you to understand this. Back in 2023 to 2025, what I've been seeing was this massive trend of using workflow automation tools, right? Specifically in SEO, you could see those posts on LinkedIn, on Twitter, where people would share their make.com or n8n workflows or even AirOps one. And I was the one also building these, right? So for example, I've talked about this on LinkedIn. I have various workflows that I've shared for automating and scaling multiple tasks that I work on for different clients. So SEO specific ones, generic ones, all of these had a lot of, hype in the last 2 to 3 years. The underlying idea for all of these tools is pretty much the same, that you're dragging nodes, you're connecting blocks manually, and then your automations gets built visually in front of you with your bare hands. That, of course, still required manual configuration of nodes, but in a world where we actually had to write code to make those kind of automations in the past, right, several years back, this was still a massive, massive deal, and everyone was jumping on the bandwagon. And rightfully so, to be honest. There was a ton of value in using these tools, and to be honest, still is. But along the same time, LLMs kept getting better, right? And if you've been noticing how things are changing because of how fast Claude is progressing, what kind of things they're releasing every week, literally, it's crazy. So in 2025, Claude came out with Claude Code, and that changed almost everything. And I think that was somewhat of a demise for drag and drop automation tools, because why would you drag and drop when you can just prompt? Claude made it literally possible with Claude Code to just describe what you want, and it will build the entire workflow for you in a couple of seconds. So all of these SEO workflow builders and drag and drop tools started becoming somewhat irrelevant. Now, of course, it didn't happen overnight, and it's still not happening overnight. Why? Because there's a massive adoption curve. All of the teams which started using tools like AirOps and many others had their entire ecosystems built within these tools, and every team was dependent on staying within that ecosystem. So if they have a new tool that can do now content audits better, they're not going to entirely shift their system, because they also have their content creation workflow in the same tools. They have their internal linking systems in the same tools, right? So there was this entire library of automations that companies built within these tools, and they simply cannot shift overnight to something like Claude Code. Even if they're vibe coding a lot, the entire ecosystem that a company depends on is very hard to shift. So that's one. Secondly, all of these companies like AirOps were offering a lot more than just workflow building. They had their teams invested in your projects. You will get on weekly calls with them. And of course, they also had a ton of additional features like AI search monitoring, and they can give you a very well-connected sort of a service, not just, vibe coding. But still, as I said, Claude Code was changing a lot of things, which means the shift was moving towards just describing what you wanted, and it will be no need for building nodes and connecting them in a manual way. You just prompt to Claude and it will write the automation for you. Now, I would still give some massive credit to AirOps, because they were the first ones who had that prompt-driven experience even in their product, right? So they had Copilot. I used to use AirOps. I still do. It's a fantastic product. And they were the first one to integrate Copilot, which gave you a very, prompt-driven workflow building experience that no other tools were offering at that time. So you could literally build a workflow inside their product by just describing what you wanted, and it will do everything for you. And this was still before Claude Code came out, which is pretty impressive. But anyways, what's happening right now is that we have the MCP era coming, where all of the tools which at some point felt threatened by Claude, Claude Code, all of these different services in the industry, basically coming from massive LLM companies like Anthropic and OpenAI, they're trying to become a part of that ecosystem. And that's their strategy to fight back. So I'll give you an example of this company called Slate, which is a workflow automation tool similar to AirOps, and they help you build content and SEO workflows. And what they've recently done is that they've released their MCP for Claude. So now what you can do is you can just build the entire workflow that you wanted inside Slate, which is again designed to be a drag and drop tool builder, by using Claude and a single prompt. So this is how it used to work in the past. Imagine you're using a product like Slate or maybe AirOps and others. What you would do is you would map out your steps in the workflow, the sequences, connect them manually, configure them for each of the node, drag and drop every step into Slate if that's the product that you're using, and then you will test, debug, and then you will keep repeating until you have the workflow completely working for you. But how it's working right now is that if you have the Claude MCP, which now Slate offers, right? They're one of the first ones in the market. You can prompt to Claude. It will build through its MCP inside Slate, right? So you can actually see the workflow being constructed inside the tool of your choosing, and then you can just jump in, make some tweaks, and run it. This is a massive shift because you don't necessarily need to shift everything to Claude at this point. You can still, of course, vibe code, and I still use Claude Code a ton, complete disclaimer. But what I mean here is if your companies were reliant on some of these platforms because they offer more than just vibe coding, right? They give you a complete AI search optimization, SEO and content engineering sort of a experience. You can still continue to use them and benefit from this advancement inside Claude. So kudos to the Slate team for building this MCP. It's a very smart move because what they've realized is that if their customers are spending time inside Claude more than anything else, right, in their day-to-day, just like I am, becoming a part of that tech stack, empowering the users to use their product through Claude is going to be a way smarter move than trying to fight it. And just to be real, it's impossible to fight companies like OpenAI and Anthropic. What you can do though is look at all of the areas that they're impacting and try to become a part of it so you can still solve the same problems that you wanted for your customers, just like Slate did. Now, what we're going to do is actually look at a workflow live using the Slate MCP inside Claude and see how it builds a workflow for us right in front of our eyes, just using a single prompt. All right, so we're inside Claude, and now we're going to build the workflow live right now using the Slate Claude MCP. Just a quick note, what you need here is basically to have the connector ready. So you go into settings, and then inside connectors, you can see this option of adding any sort of a connector. You would need to configure them, connect them, and then you will have it ready. For example, I have Slate here, so that's how you add a connector. Now, back to the workflow building part. What you want to do is make sure that your connector is ready to use. So here, if you go into connectors, you can see Slate is selected and it's turned on. Now, we just need to describe what we wanted. I'm thinking, what sort of a workflow can we experiment with? I recently saw this idea from Brian Law, where I think he built a tool for users to use where they can find all of the instances on blog, finding different blog posts where the product of their company is not mentioned properly, or maybe not mentioned at all. So for example, if you have, let's say, on Azure's blog, a topic like how to do keyword research, maybe there's no mention of Keyword Explorer, right, of Ahrefs. So in a similar way, if we can build a lightweight version of that, that would be pretty cool. So maybe for Modash, for example, if I can build a tool, a workflow inside Slate that helps me find all of the instances on our blog where either there's no mention of Modash as a product, none of our features, or the mention is simply not accurate or outdated, right? Because all of our features keeps updating and we keep pushing new things live. So that would be pretty cool. So let's try that out. So I have a prompt ready for this, which I'm going to plug here. So it says, hey, I want you to build a workflow inside Slate where we will have a knowledge base, which will consist of all of the product features of Modash. So imagine some sort of a very detailed product Bible with all of the features and a detailed description of each. And looking at that knowledge base, it should analyze all of the blog posts on Modash blog, which I'm going to give you the exact URL for. And then it should scrape all of the content and find the instances in any of the blog posts that you can find in the blog where the product is simply not talked about enough from a product marketing standpoint. And just FYI, if this prompt feels very casual in tone, this is because I've used Whisperflow, which is like a voice dictation app, to write this prompt. So I was actually just talking to AI, not necessarily writing it very clearly. All right, so we continue here. So it could be that there are pages which simply don't have any mention of Modash. So I'm talking about the magnitude, right? So there would be pages that have absolutely no mention of Modash. Then there would be some that might have a missing screenshot or maybe some inaccuracies, etc. So let's classify them separately. And then at the end, you can also see, I also want you to make sure that you ask me all of the right questions before you actually start building this workflow. This is important. I think it helps me just construct the thing more clearly. And of course, we also don't want to waste any, LLM power, as in tokens, on building something that is not required. So this is it. Let's go and see what it builds for us. All right, so you can see our buddy has started asking us some questions. How will you provide the knowledge base or the product Bible. So I'm thinking I can upload it as a bunch of PDFs. So I'll say it's going to be PDFs, a few different ones, not a single. I don't have a single product Bible. It's going to be a set of PDFs, right? How should the blog URL be provided? I'll paste the URLs when I run it. Actually, I can just provide it right now. So here we go. We have the blog for Modash. Where should the output go? I want it in a Google Sheet, or maybe you can just go with Slate Sheet for now, because it would of course need authorization of my account. So maybe Slate Sheet would be fine. What should each output row contain? Pick all that apply. So we need a blog URL, severity score, specific feature gaps. That should be good. Suggested edits or insertion points. That would be strong as a suggestion as well. So let's keep that in. And just FYI, you can see Slate Sheet that I've selected. What that means is a table that Slate provides. I think in AirOps you call them grid. And if I was building a real workflow in some of the actual instances for a client or maybe for Modash, I would pick Google Sheet because that's the easiest to work with. But that of course requires me to connect the account and all. So I'm just trying to keep it high level right now. All right, so next set of questions. How many blog posts should it analyze from Modash? I would say maybe all blog posts. It could be all, to be honest, but let's keep it lightweight. So top 20, 30 most recent posts should be fine. Given you want it lightweight, plus PDFs as knowledge base, I would recommend running analysis per post so the LLM has full context each time. Okay, so I think we can still bash them. Right, let's see. Right, so you can see Claude has started building the workflow. So it's pulling up stuff from Slate. So it's listing the workspaces, it's listing block types, it's finding block schema. So it's actually making this happen right now. Now I have enough context. Let me plan the entire workflow. It's planning the workflow similar to how you would do it manually. And again, I have been using these tools, so I know how big of a pain this is. As in, it's not necessarily like end of the world, but you still have to use your brain power, right? And if this is something that you can just do automatically, why would you not do that? So now you can see it's actually creating the workflow for me, which is amazing. Let's see how it goes. We can also expand to see what's going on right now. So maybe in sub steps, we can check out as things happen in real time. Right, so it says workflow created and validated. Now let me set up the Slate grid sheet with the right columns for the output. So what it's doing now is once it has created the workflow, it's going to give us the entire sheet, which is called grid, as I mentioned inside AirOps. So it has all of the right columns already. Again, it used to be manual because once you've set up the workflow that you wanted, you still have to go into these products and do all of that configuration, like logistical things of what columns you need and all of that stuff manually. And now it's happening with AI. So workflow built, Modash blog product gap audit, workflow ID, inputs, you upload your product Bible, the blog index URL, and number of blog posts to audit. So it looks like the workflow is live. So let's check it out inside Slate and see what it looks like. All right, so I'm inside my Slate workspace where I have a couple of workflows already built, and I can see this one at the top, Modash blog product gap audit. It is the same exact title that I received from Claude right here. So it looks like it's the same one. And now we can actually also test this and see what it feels like to use this workflow in practice. All right, so this is the first look. We have input, where the product Bible of PDFs needs to be updated. We need a blog index URL, number of posts to analyze. And then the next one is to scrape blog index, extract post URLs. It's a Python script. Then we have a loop over posts. So it's scraping each of the posts and it's using a loop function to do it over and over again until the entire list is done. Then it assembles the batch, again using a Python code. We have an LLM step. It's using GPT-4o for batch gap analysis. Then flatten for the sheet. So it's formatting at the end. And then it's going to give us the output. So This is amazing, right? This is the kind of stuff that you would need to build manually, and it would take hours if you're using a product like AirOps and of course like Slate in the past. If they didn't have this MCP, and I'm pretty sure, I think at this point maybe AirOps does not have these kind of capabilities, but they still do through their MCP. For building the brand kit and a couple of other things. Maybe the workflow building part is still in the process, I'm not sure. But if it comes out, it's again gonna be a game changer even for their users. You know what's the best part is? All of the configuration is already done as well, right? So even if you open up each of the nodes, you will see it's working really well, right? So for example, you can see the website URL, exact variables added. Even if you go here, the entire piece of code is properly written, it will work. Inside the loop, you have everything configured properly for each of the step. So maybe we can test this out now and see how it goes. So now let's actually test this and see if it works. So if I click on test all, it's asking me for product Bible, blog, index URL, and number of posts to analyze. But to be honest, I don't want this in the input step, the product Bible. Maybe there's a way for Slate to build a knowledge base. If I just give Claude the set of PDFs, and perhaps it can just, do the thing for me. So let's go back and see if that works. If I go back here and we upload our files. So I have the product Bible here. Let's give it as a CSV. So I've selected the product Bible as a CSV, and then I'm going to attach this prompt, which is saying, I'm giving you the CSV of the product Bible to be used as a knowledge base. I don't want it to be an input step in the workflow. Can you build this in a way that the workflow uses this CSV as a built-in resource to analyze the product mentions across blog posts? So let's give it back. And I want to mention this is actually making this happen inside Slate. So I would add maybe one more sentence. Make this update in the same Slate workflow. Okay, so let's hit apply and see what happens. I'll take a look at the CSV first and then embed it directly into the workflow so it's no longer an input. Perfect. All right, so it's getting the workflow again, it's pulling it up, and then it's removing product Bible input, keeping only blog, index URL, and number of posts. So it's adding new code block, rewiring the sequence as well for some of the nodes. And then LLM prompt also now starts to reference this output of the product Bible. So it's making basically all of those updates. It's literally updating the workflow right in front of our eyes. And if you're wondering why I did this change, it's because I've tried building these kind of workflows in the past, and every time I have to find a file for running a workflow which will not necessarily require that resource and again, it simply doesn't make sense, right? Like the product Bible is not going to change. And by the way, if you're wondering what the product Bible is, it's this massive resource created recently by the Modash team, where we have a massive library of the description of all of our features. All of these happen to be subpages. What I've given here to this agent inside this Slate workflow is not necessarily all of these subpages, but only a CSV for this entire thing. Which is again good enough just for us to test this workflow. Anyways, coming back here, we can see the update is complete. So it should have made everything exactly as we wanted. So let's go back to Slate and see what we have. So I came back to the same workflow and refreshed, and now I can see the input has changed. So we have blog, index URL, number of posts to analyze. Those are the only two things required, and that the knowledge base that we wanted is now loaded as a separate node using this Python script. So it's going to load this product Bible that we gave as a CSV. All right, so let's test this now. So we have the blog index to be provided. This is exactly this one. And then number of posts to analyze, let's say maybe 30, right? And we can say test all. All right, so the test execution has started. We can see the logs are now popping up. So it started with loading the product Bible, scraping the blog index, extracting post URLs, and then there's this loop function right here, which is going over each of those blog posts and scraping the content and then detecting that whether we have those mentions of the product, whether they're inaccurate, can they be improved, all of that stuff. So it will take a while. because it's, a loop. It's going over each of those 30 blog posts. All right, so it looks like the output is ready. This workflow worked in the very first run. It was completely built using Claude, and I can see the output is exactly what I wanted. The URL, the title, the severity of the product mention missing or it being inaccurate, the mention count. So it says this post mentions Modash in the context of tracking creator content across platforms, but misses several other relevant features that could be used to enhance the discussion on influencer marketing strategies. The feature gaps, campaign analytics, right? So you can add stats of fake followers detection, profile data and metrics, why it's relevant, suggested edits. Like it's literally telling me where you can improve this. All right, so it looks like the workflow is working. It's doing what we wanted. It's analyzing the blog posts. It's finding those instances where either Modash is not mentioned or it can be improved in its description, accuracy, and just giving us more ways of promoting the product. Now you can still make updates to this workflow if you wanted manually. For example, if I wanted to change the destination of the output, right, where we receive the final outcome, I might change it to a Google Sheet, right? So I can just plug Sheet here, add it as the final node, and then configure it, add my Google Sheet, select the connection, and it will again work, and we will have our output within a Google Sheet. Now, one more thing, Claude also said that it created a sheet inside Slate for us, which basically is a table, right, where you can use multiple workflows together. And if we open up Sheets from this sidebar above workflows, it should have the same, right, there we go. So we have Modash, blog, product, gap audit, and it's a sheet. It's a table created within Slate. So Claude, using its MCP, did 2 to 3 things simultaneously. Created the knowledge base inside this product. It created the entire workflow, mapped it automatically, and then it also created this sheet based on what columns it should have and all of that stuff configured automatically. If I click on this sheet, you can see these are all of those values that we looked at in the output of that workflow. So if I go back to the original workflow, you can see in the output right here, in these JSON values, we have URL, title, severity, mention count, summary, feature gaps, etc. And then coming back to this sheet right here, we have URL, title, severity, all of that stuff. So we have everything that we wanted to make this workflow work inside Slate. And all we've done is literally just given one prompt to build the workflow and one prompt to update it based on some of our needs, right? Any kind of iteration that you wanted to make, and just it asking us a bunch of questions before it started building the workflow. Isn't it awesome? And by the way, this Claude MCP thing is not stopping here. This is just one example of what you can do using Claude's MCP, but I'm literally using it for many more things, which I simply cannot talk about in this video. So let's keep it for another time. If you're finding me through YouTube for the very first time, I create more content on LinkedIn, and that's the best place for you to connect with me and say hi. If you're already following me on LinkedIn, you can expect more of this content to keep coming out. And until the next one, I'll see you soon. Have a great day.